Yeah, once again, we're here to talk about race in America. I know we just had Tim and Frank Deuce do that just a few weeks ago, but I'm a historian. Americans have to understand their history. Doesn't matter what your governor or whatever says, you have to be able to tell what is going on. Thank you. Okay, fine. We need to learn from our past. And I have to say that I've been a big fan of the 1619 Project, started by Nicole Hannah-Jones, published in the New York Times. But, and this has been the source of some controversy. But for those who don't know, the typical way of starting a recounting of the history of the United States is with the 1620 landing at Plymouth Rock. And this just goes back a year. Actually, from our perspective here in Virginia, we say we were here first. So, why not start in Virginia? But really, it's because that's the year the first shipment of captured Africans appeared on our shores and our history with slavery started. Now, this, as I say, has generated a tremendous amount of controversy. There's been the 1776 Project trying to take America away from that beginning to something more optimistic. And I'm fully aware of that. I'm sympathetic. My idea of American history was always optimistic. I look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and I see America as a beautiful building still governed by the Constitution that we wrote almost 250 years ago. But in terms of houses, that makes us an old house. I don't know what your houses are like. Mine is kind of old. Old houses have a lot of character. They have a lot of sense of rooms that have been added on and joyous added here and there. But they also tend to have creepy basements that flood and are full of crickets and stuff like that. I hope I'm not being autobiographical here, but don't come into my basement. So, okay. Slavery is there right from the beginning. And we know that here in this church that is now UUCville, but used to be the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Church. We all know about Thomas Jefferson. We know that he wrote "All men are created equal," which is a central founding document for our republic and a shining light to the world. Yes, 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 but he also owned slaves, to say nothing of his relationship with Sally Hemings, who, after all, was his wife's half-sister. If you don't know that, I can tell you about that later. But I mean, it's part of the creepiness of our early history that we have to deal with things like that. So America is the shining city on the hill, the bastion of freedom for the world, but it was also built on enslaved labor. One of my favorite quotes comes from Samuel Johnson, who once wrote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" So it's with this in mind that I put forth the idea that was presented by Isabel Wilkerson in her book, which is that America doesn't just have racism, America has a caste system. Caste system stratifies society into different layers. Some people are on top, some people are on the bottom. Or to use, I'll just quote her language here, a caste system is an artificial construction. It is a fixed, embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups. She spends a lot of time, of course, thinking about the oldest caste system in the world, which comes from India. And the idea is with India that there are 4 castes. This comes from the god Brahma, and each of the castes is part of his body, so that the highest caste, the Brahmins, are from his head, These are the priests and teachers. And they're given a sort of a golden thread to wear so that they can feel that every day. Then there are the Kshatriyas, who are from his shoulders. These are rulers and especially soldiers. Then there are the Vaisyas that come from the thighs, who are merchants and traders, and the Sudras from the feet, who are laborers. Okay, those are the four castes. But there's another caste, who are literally outcasts, the untouchables, now known as the Dalit, which means the broken people. And this is roughly 15% of the population. The Dalit are given occupations that everybody needs to have done, but nobody wants to do. And in India, that's cleaning latrines, often by hand, disposing of dead animals, sweeping streets, hauling rocks, scavenging. And all of this comes with a tremendous sense of shame that helps to cement them into place. The Dalit have lived in constant fear of being publicly humiliated, paraded naked, beaten, and raped with impunity by upper-class Hindus seeking to keep them in their place. Now, as far as modern day statistics, my statistics are not all that up to date, but the latest from India's National Crime Records Bureau, this is from like 2000, but at that point they said 25,455 crimes were committed against Dalits. That meant every hour, 2 Dalits are assaulted. Every day, 3 Dalit women are raped, 2 Dalits are murdered, and 2 Dalit homes are torched. And they say, these are just the ones that were reported. Most of them are not reported. The people are just cannot even bear the thought of contacting the police. The Dalit do this not so much because of race, but because of who they are. They're identifiable primarily by their last names, which are related to the work that they do. But it's also things that are ingrained: their bearing, their accents, and their clothing, which over the centuries were required to be lowly and menial, as well as a tendency to be darker skinned than upper class people, but not always. But all of this comes with things that should be strangely familiar to us. They're forbidden to share the same water. They're forbidden to intermarry. When they come on the sidewalk, they're supposed to get off for you. All of this is strangely familiar to us. As Wilkerson puts it, in both countries and at the same time, the lowest castes toiled for their masters. African Americans in the tobacco fields along the Chesapeake or in the cotton fields of Mississippi, Dalits plucking tea in Kerala and cotton in Nandurbar. They both worked as enslaved people first, but later, for the right to live on the land they were farming. For African Americans, that was called sharecropping. Dalits, it was called saldari. Both still confined to their fixed roles at the bottom of their respective worlds. And yes, caste system was officially outlawed in the Indian Constitution in 1950, just as we had Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. But things change very, very slowly. The justification between these two systems, though, is different. In India, caste is divine law. It comes from Brahma, it comes from the creation of the world. You'd better not mess with it. It's hereditary, it is immutable, et cetera, et cetera. We don't really have that. Yes, there is a passage from Genesis talking about Noah, saying that when Ham saw Noah naked after a drunken bout, he wasn't cursed, but his children were cursed. And a lot of preachers in the 19th century would use that as saying that God is justifying slavery. I think that we can see that that is primarily a pretext, because there was one thing that happened when that boat arrived on our shores in 1619. When people looked at the Africans and decided to make them, well, to work for them, but eventually to enslave them, there was one thing that was very convenient. It was their skin color, which made them immediately and permanently identifiable. And soon there were laws saying that any child born to a slave is going to be a slave. And pretty soon we get the whole idea that the caste system is tied up with race. And this caste system, as we know, pervasive and centuries long. Yes, we did have a civil war. We did finally end slavery. But what happened after that? Well, we had the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But there's a loophole, except as a punishment for crime. Yeah. Got that? Our picture? Yes, right, chain gangs. Made up of people who were arrested for God knows what reason, but the basic idea was you could put them in chains and you could set them to work. And this is what built the railroads in the South. This is the fate of John Henry, who it turns out was originally a free black man from New Jersey who joined the Union Army, but ended up being arrested in Petersburg, Virginia, and ended up working on a, not exactly a chain gang, but was enslaved labor in the mountains between here and West Virginia, and that's where we get the John Henry song from. It's just making it clear that there are other ways to maintain all this stuff. Same way that the 15th Amendment, barred people from, prohibited barring people from voting based on race, but of course there were so many ways around that. It took until the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s to finally eliminate most of those, but then the Supreme Court said, things are okay. So, that has been seriously abused. And then we have the 14th Amendment, probably the most abused piece of the Constitution. The Equal Protection Clause forbids any state from denying any person within its jurisdiction to the equal protection of the laws. Well, one of the first things they did was to say, well, person can also mean a corporation. So that, in fact, Southern Pacific Railroad, for example, is one of the earliest ones in the 19th century to say, yes, this stands for us. And in fact, if you look at the number of cases that were taken to the Supreme Court between the time the 14th Amendment was founded in 1868 and 1912, I think there were 340 cases. About 28 of them had to do with Black people. The rest had to do with corporations. And now we have the fact that the same language has been literally used this week to eliminate affirmative action, a clause that was clearly meant to allow Congress to pass race-conscious legislation, like the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves get housing, food, and education. All of this stuff, these originalists are not looking at the context of this, and they are saying, in fact, it just says, don't use race at all. Everybody has to start the same. So, I mean, the hypocrisy of it is stunning, but that's this week's news. Now, I mean, I do have to grant that our caste system is less harsh than it used to be. I mean, over the course of my lifetime, we've had the civil rights revolution of the 1950s and 60s, which obviously eliminated the worst parts of Jim Crow, including segregation, bans on intermarriage, and hey, in 2008, we even elected a Black president. And for a lot of us, that just felt like, okay, we've finally gotten over a hump. And I think it's clear that in retrospect, that made things worse, because a lot of people saw his election as a sign that the caste system was really weakening. And you have to keep in mind that even though Obama won comfortably both times he was there, a majority of white people then voted against him. And all this has resulted in things over the past 7 years that are too numerous and pervasive to sum up here. I just have to kind of leave you with that. So, is the problem racism? And you can say yes, and you can also say no, not necessarily. Race and caste are intermingled, but as Wilkerson puts it, race is the skin, caste is the bones. Race is the excuse that we have used to explain why the caste system was created, and these days we don't even really believe in race anymore as a scientific concept. We have our DNA genome. We're aware that we are, 99.9% similar. It's just these tiny variations that produce different types of people. And it's also true that calling people racist no longer really works. According to Wilkerson, racism is one of the most, quote, contentious and misunderstood terms in our culture. It is radioactive. It's resented, feared, denied, lobbed back toward anyone who dares to suggest it. It's been reduced in our vocabulary to a feeling or a character flaw that determines whether one is a good person or not. It has come to mean an overt and declared hatred of a group, something that very few people are going to own up to. So as a personal attack, if you call someone a racist, you think you're forcing an admission, first of all, that is not likely to come, and that keeps the focus on a single individual rather than the system that created that individual, and gives cover for those who, by aiming at others, can present themselves as noble and bias-free for having pointed the finger first, all of which keeps the hierarchy intact. So by shifting the focus to race, perhaps this is a semantic gain, but I think that it also makes it clear that this stuff is not about race, it's about power. These systems, as I said, are sturdy and long-lasting, and we really had one of the best in the world. There was another society that for a brief but notorious time tried to set up a caste system. I was also thinking of South Africa, but I'm talking about Nazi Germany. And when they were looking for legislation to try to define their Jews as outcasts, the place they came to was the United States of America, and specifically Virginia, because we're the ones who created the laws about miscegenation or racial mixture. We're the ones that defined exactly how you manage to monitor that stuff. And in fact, the Germans were very impressed by that. They finally decided they did not want to go as extreme as us. I think it's like you had to have 2 Jewish grandparents or 1 Jewish grandparent or something like that. They were not willing to go for the 1 drop of blood rule, which was our case, where you just say any amount of black blood is going to make you black. And that's the kind of thing that certainly would have exploded with 23andMe, as people are discovering, in fact, oh my God, I've got 0.01% black blood. I mean, that technically would have been enough under much of this legislation to suddenly demote you to the lower caste. That's not the way things actually worked in this country, but those were our laws. So what can we do about it? Well, as you use, none of this is news. We've been doing anti-racist work for a long time, and I do note that at last week's General Assembly, the UUs did vote to revise the Covenant Clause, Article 2, in our bylaws to include a new commitment to, quote, dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. So that it's got 1 more year. In the next General Assembly, it'll have to pass by a 2/3 vote, but then that will be part of our new covenant. So we can applaud ourselves for that. We also have to do our own personal work on race, because it's embedded in everybody who grew up in this country. I have to say, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I got a heavy dose of it. My parents were not particularly racist. I didn't really get it from them. I got it from watching television. I got it from watching The Little Rascals. Any of you familiar with that thing? I mean, it came out in the 30s, and boy, if you look at it, it is just full of stuff that comes out of minstrelsy. It is just presenting Black characters in ways that you just look at. In fact, I mean, Eddie Murphy did a thing about buckwheat on Saturday Night Live. That was one of his characters. Ote, you know, this kind of thing that he does. So everybody has to do that. I have to do this constantly. It never goes away. My wife likes to do co-counseling, which is a type of therapy that is discharging old hurts from your upbringing. And the idea is that if you discharge enough, you eventually will exhaust it. But they say it's like going to a cafeteria where you pick up a tray and immediately there's another tray underneath it. You pick up another tray and another tray pops up. And they say eventually you can exhaust the pile and there can be no trays left. For me, for this whole caste system, it's not going to go away in my lifetime. I'm going to be pulling out those trays one by one. But I have to do it. I have to do it. I have to look at Black people. And I remember that they say that when you see a face, you have a split second before things load in from your upbringing. And I have to look at Black people and remember, yeah, no, you're not the person I thought you were, but I'm still going to think that for the rest of my life. And I just have to own up to it. I have to own up to the racism that is part of my upbringing. What does Isabel Wilkerson call for? Radical empathy. And let me close with this lengthy thing from the end of her book. She says, empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is looking across at someone and feeling sorry, often at times of loss. Empathy is not pity. Pity is looking down from above and feeling a distant kind of sadness. Empathy is commonly viewed as putting yourself in someone else's shoes and imagining how you would feel. That's a start, but it is little more than role-playing, and it's not enough in the ruptured world we live in. Radical empathy, on the other hand, means putting in the work to educate oneself and listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you have never been in and perhaps never will. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. If each of us could truly see and connect with the humanity of the person in front of us and search for that key that opens the door to whatever we may have in common, it could begin to affect how we see the world and others in it. Each time a person reaches across caste and makes a connection, it helps to break the back of caste. In a world without caste, being male or female, light or dark, immigrant or native born, would have no bearing on what anyone was perceived as being capable of. In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others in our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have been led to believe. A world without caste would set everyone free. Well, that's the end of my sermon. We are going to now sing a hymn. I know that when I was meeting with Reverend Tim, I said, there's this hymn that this old house. I said, there's a hymn called This Old House, isn't there? And he just kind of looked at me and he kind of threw the hymnal at me because he knew there was no such hymn. But then I found out it's actually called This Old World. And that's the one that I want us to sing. So excuse me while I move from here over to there.